To understand what people in the Middle Ages thought about magic, you first have to understand the world they lived in. It wasn't like our world. It was a place filled with invisible forces, a world where the spiritual was just as real as the physical, maybe even more so. Their universe was a story, and God was the author. Everything had a place and a purpose in his grand design. At the very top was God. He was the source of all power, all goodness, all miracles. He created the universe and set the rules. Below him were the angels, his messengers and soldiers. Below them were humans, stuck in the middle, a messy mix of spirit and flesh. And below humans were the animals, the plants, and the rocks. It was a great chain, a ladder with everyone and everything on its proper rung. But there was another power in this story, the devil. He was a fallen angel who had rebelled against God. He and his demons were real, active beings who roamed the earth. Their goal was simple: to ruin God's creation and drag human souls down to hell. They were tricksters, tempters, and sources of immense evil, so you had this constant cosmic war going on. God and his angels on one side, the devil and his demons on the other, and humanity was the battlefield. Every choice a person made, every prayer they said, every sin they committed was a small part of this massive struggle. This wasn't just a metaphor for them, it was reality. They believed they could be tempted by a demon whispering in their ear just as surely as they could be helped by a saint hearing their prayer. This is the world where magic existed, and the first question anyone asked about a magical act was simple: where did the power come from? There were only two real options. It either came from God or it came from the devil. If the power came from God, it wasn't called magic, it was called a miracle. A saint healing a sick person wasn't a magician, he was a conduit for God's divine power. A holy relic that cured blindness wasn't a magical amulet, it was an object filled with God's grace. The church performed rituals all the time that looked a lot like magic. Priests blessed water to make it holy. They performed exorcisms to cast out demons. They said specific words in a specific order during Mass to turn bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. To a modern eye, these look like spells, but in the medieval mind, they were the complete opposite. This was sanctioned, holy power flowing down from God through his chosen institution, the Church. It was legitimate, it was safe, it was part of the divine order. Anything else, any supernatural act that didn't come from God, had to come from the other side. If a village sorcerer healed a sick person using a strange chant and a mix of herbs, the church would argue that the healing didn't come from the herbs. It came from a demon that the sorcerer had called upon, either knowingly or unknowingly. The devil was always happy to help, but his help always came with a price. He might heal your body to trick you into damning your soul. This created a very sharp line. On one side, divine miracles. On the other, demonic magic. There was no neutral ground. Magic, by its very definition, was an attempt to get supernatural results by bypassing God. It was a turning away from the proper source of power and making a deal, big or small, with the enemy. It was a form of rebellion. It was trying to steal a bit of power for yourself, to become a little god in your own right, which is exactly the sin that got the devil thrown out of heaven in the first place. But it wasn't quite that simple. There was a fuzzy gray area that people called natural magic. This was a tricky concept. The idea was that God had hidden secret properties or virtues in all of his creation. A certain stone might have a natural ability to cure headaches. An herb might have a hidden power to bring good luck. The moon might have a real physical influence on people's moods. Natural magic was the study and use of these hidden properties. A person practicing natural magic wasn't calling on demons. They were just using the secret mechanics of God's universe, like a scientist. They were learning the instruction manual for the world. Many learned men, scholars, and doctors believed in this. They studied astrology not to tell the future, but to understand the influence of the planets on health. They studied alchemy, trying to understand the hidden nature of metals. The church was suspicious of natural magic, but didn't always outright condemn it. As long as you weren't trying to command spirits or force the world to do your bidding, it might be okay. But the line was incredibly thin. When does using a special stone for luck become idolatry? When does reciting a charm over an herb turn into a demonic pact? It was easy to slip from studying God's creation to trying to control it. And for most churchmen, that slip was a step toward the devil, so this was the fundamental view. The universe was alive with spiritual power. That power was divided into two camps, divine and demonic. Anything supernatural you did was a vote for one side or the other. Using the church's rituals was a vote for God. Using any other kind of ritual, any spell or charm, was a vote for the devil, even if you didn't mean it to be. You were either working with God's system or you were trying to cheat it, and cheating was the devil's game. Magic wasn't just one thing in the Middle Ages, it existed on a spectrum, from the simple folk charm of a peasant to the complex ritual of a university-educated scholar. People at the time didn't always use these terms, but we can look back and see two broad categories: low magic and high magic. They were different in their goals, their methods, and the people who practiced them. Low magic was the magic of the common people. It was practical, local, and often messy. It wasn't about gaining ultimate power or summoning great demons, it was about survival. Life for the average person was difficult and unpredictable. Crops could fail, cows could get sick, children could die from fever, a neighbor might hold a grudge. Low magic was a set of tools to deal with these everyday problems. It was the magic of healing warts, finding lost sheep, making someone fall in love with you, or protecting your home from evil spirits. The practitioners were often called cunning folk, wise women, or charmers. They were part of the community. You didn't go to the cunning woman because you wanted to sell your soul to the devil. You went to her because your tooth ached and the priest's prayers weren't working fast enough. The methods of low magic were based on tradition and what seemed to work. It was a jumble of half-remembered pagan rituals, folk wisdom about plants, and a thick layer of Christian language. A charm to cure a fever might involve tying a specific knot while reciting the names of the three wise men. A potion to protect a cow might be made from herbs gathered at midnight, stirred while making the sign of the cross. This blending is key. The people using these charms didn't see a conflict between their Christian faith and their folk practices. To them, it was all part of the same enchanted world. The name of Jesus or a local saint was a powerful word, just like the name of a special herb was powerful. They were borrowing the power of the church and applying it to their own problems. They would say prayers and attend mass, but they also knew to tie a red string around a baby's wrist to ward off evil. It was a form of spiritual insurance using every tool available. The church, for its part, was deeply uncomfortable with low magic. To the clergy, it was a mess of superstition. They saw it as a misunderstanding of true faith at best and a gateway to demonic influence at worst. A priest might tell his flock that trusting a charm instead of God's will was a sin. But for a long time, the official response was often just to preach against it, to try and educate people away from their ignorant beliefs. The cunning woman in the village was usually seen as a nuisance, not a diabolical threat. That would change later, but for much of the period, low magic was just a persistent, annoying part of everyday life that the church tried to correct. And high magic, on the other hand, was a different world entirely. This was the magic of the elite. It was learned, intellectual, and dangerous. It was practiced by educated men, often clerics, scholars, or nobles who could read Latin and had access to rare books. High magic wasn't about curing warts. It was about gaining knowledge and power. It was about understanding the secrets of the cosmos, commanding spirits, and changing reality itself. This was book magic. It relied on complex texts called grimoires, which contained detailed instructions for elaborate rituals. These rituals involved drawing complicated circles on the floor, using special tools like wands and swords, and reciting long incantations in foreign languages like Greek or Hebrew. The goal was to force a spiritual being, an angel, a demon, or the spirit of a dead person to appear and do the magician's bidding. One of the most famous and feared forms of high magic was necromancy. The word literally means divination by the dead. It was the practice of summoning the spirits of the dead to gain hidden knowledge, often about the future. This was considered one of the darkest forms of magic because it directly violated God's laws and involved trafficking with forbidden spirits. Other forms of high magic included astrology and alchemy. While these could be practiced as natural magic or science, they easily crossed the line. An astrologer might not just study the influence of the stars, but try to use that knowledge to cast spells to change someone's fate. An alchemist might not just try to turn lead into gold, but seek the philosopher's stone to gain immortality, cheating the death God had ordained for all humanity. Unlike the cunning woman, the practitioner of high magic often knew exactly what he was doing. He was consciously trying to access power outside the church's control. He might believe he was smart enough to control the demons he summoned to get what he wanted without paying the ultimate price. He saw himself as a master, a scholar of the unseen world. The church had no tolerance for high magic. This wasn't just superstition, this was heresy. This was a direct, intentional pact with the devil. Necromancers and ceremonial magicians were seen as the ultimate enemies of God. They were actively choosing to serve demons to satisfy their own pride and ambition. The punishments for this kind of magic were severe, often involving imprisonment, excommunication, or even death. So you have these two streams of magic flowing through the medieval world. One was a muddy, practical stream of folk beliefs used by ordinary people to get by. The other was a dark, hidden river of forbidden knowledge sought by the educated and the ambitious. The first was seen as a problem of ignorance. The second was seen as a problem of malice. But as time went on, the church began to see both streams as flowing from the same poisoned source, the devil. Magic in the medieval period wasn't just about wanting something to happen, it was about doing things. It was a craft with its own tools, materials, and techniques. The way magic was performed says a lot about how people thought it worked. Whether it was a simple healing charm or a complex demonic summoning, the process mattered. For the common person practicing low magic, the tools were all around them. They used the stuff of everyday life: herbs, stones, water, salt, thread, and wood. These weren't just objects, they were filled with potential power. A particular herb wasn't just a plant, it was a vessel of healing energy. A stone with a natural hole in it wasn't just a rock, it was a protective shield against evil spirits. The magic was in finding the right object and knowing how to activate its hidden virtue. Word words were the most important tool of all. A spoken charm or incantation was the key that unlocked the magic. These charms were often a strange mix of sense and nonsense. They might include fragments of Latin prayers, the names of saints, or garbled words that had been passed down for generations. The exact wording was crucial. Saying the charm backwards might reverse its effect. Stumbling over a word might break the spell. The power of names was central. Naming something gave you power over it. This is why charms so often invoke the names of Jesus, Mary, or the Trinity. By speaking these holy names, the charmer was attempting to borrow a spark of their divine power for their own purpose. It was like invoking a higher authority. But they might also use the names of angels, or even strange, foreign-sounding names that were thought to be the secret names of spirits. Actions and gestures were just as important as words. A healing charm might require the healer to make the sign of the cross over a wound. A love spell might involve tying a knot in a piece of thread while thinking of the desired person. The direction you stirred a potion, the time of day an herb was gathered, the phase of the moon, all these details mattered. It was a kind of recipe. If you followed the steps correctly, you would get the desired result. The physical act connected the practitioner's will to the invisible forces of the world. The magic circle was a tool that bridged the gap between low and high magic, but it was most famous in the high, ceremonial kind. It was a sacred space, a temporary fortress drawn on the ground. Inside the circle, the magician was safe from the spirits he was about to summon. The circle was often incredibly complex, filled with holy names, symbols, and geometric shapes. It was a microcosm of the divine order, a little pocket of consecrated ground where the magician could stand and command the forces of chaos outside. For the learned magician, the most essential tool was his book, the grimoire. These were hand-copied manuals of magic filled with forbidden knowledge. They contained the names of demons, their sigils or symbols, and the exact rituals needed to summon and control them. Famous grimoires, like the Key of Solomon, were legendary. They were seen as objects of immense power and danger. To even own such a book was proof of demonic intent. The high magician's other tools were more specialized and exotic. He might use a wand made from a specific type of wood, cut at a precise astrological moment. He would have a consecrated sword or knife, not for fighting, but for drawing the circle and threatening disobedient spirits. He used special inks to draw his diagrams and pure parchment for his talismans. He would burn specific types of incense to create the right atmosphere and attract the right kind of spirit. The language of high magic was formal and commanding. The incantations were long, often in Latin, and structured like legal documents or royal decrees. The magician didn't politely ask the demon to appear. He commanded it, using the names of God and his angels as weapons. He would threaten the spirit with divine punishment if it didn't obey. This was a battle of wills. The magician believed that by using the correct formulas and names of power, he could force even a prince of hell to do his bidding. There was a profound belief in sympathy and contagion. This was the idea that things that were once connected remain connected. If you wanted to curse someone, getting a lock of their hair or a piece of their clothing was essential. By doing something to the hair, you could do something to the person. This is the principle behind the classic voodoo doll. Likewise, an object could absorb the quality of a person or a place. A stone from a holy shrine could hold some of that holiness. So, when you look at how magic was done, you see a world where the physical and spiritual were completely intertwined. The words had the power to change reality. Objects were filled with secret energy. The right actions, performed at the right time, could influence the invisible web of forces that governed the world. For the low magician, it was about coaxing and nudging these forces to help with daily life. For the high magician, it was about mastering them, bending them to his will through force of knowledge and ritual. In both cases, the act of magic was a deliberate, hands-on attempt to step outside the normal rules and make something happen. The church's relationship with magic was long, complicated, and grew darker over time. It wasn't a simple case of magic is bad. The problem was much deeper. It was about authority, theology, and control. The church saw itself as the sole gatekeeper of the supernatural. It had the keys to the kingdom of heaven, and it wasn't about to let anyone else pick the lock. The core theological problem was idolatry. The first commandment says, "You shall have no other gods before me." For the church, practicing magic was a form of worship. When a person used a charm to heal their cow instead of praying to God, they were putting their faith in the charm, not in God. They were treating a bundle of herbs or a mumbled phrase as a source of power. This was, in the eyes of the church, a kind of idolatry. You were worshiping the creation instead of the creator. This led to the second problem where the power came from. As we've seen, church thinkers came to believe that any supernatural power that didn't come directly from God had to come from demons. The devil was the great deceiver. He could perform lying wonders, things that looked like miracles but were actually tricks designed to lead people astray. So, even if a charm seemed to work, the church argued it was a demonic illusion. The demon might heal your body, but only to gain a foothold in your soul. The village charmer might think she was using the power of plants, but a theologian like Thomas Aquinas would argue that a demon was secretly working through her, making the magic happen. She was an unwitting pawn in the devil's game. This meant that all magic, from the most innocent-seeming folk remedy to the darkest necromantic ritual, was ultimately demonic. It was a deal with the devil. The person making the deal might not even know it, but ignorance was no excuse. By seeking power outside of God and the church, they were opening a door to demonic influence. This belief, which became stronger in the later Middle Ages, was the intellectual foundation for the great witch hunts that would follow. The church also had a problem of competition. It offered its own set of supernatural solutions to the problems of life. If you were sick, you could pray to a saint. If you feared evil, you could use holy water. If you wanted a good harvest, you could have the priest bless your fields. The church had a monopoly on the supernatural marketplace. The local cunning woman was a competitor. She was offering a similar service supernatural help for everyday problems, but without the church's official approval. This was freelance religion, and the church, like any large institution, did not like freelance operations. The line between a religious ritual and a magical spell could be very blurry, and the church knew it. What was the difference between wearing a blessed medallion of a saint for protection and wearing a pagan amulet? Why was a priest's exorcism a holy rite, while a sorcerer's binding spell was a demonic one? The church's answer was all about intent and authority. The priest was acting with God's authority granted to him through the church. He was asking for God's help. The sorcerer was acting on his own authority, trying to command forces. He was demanding, not asking. It was the difference between prayer and coercion. But for the average person, this distinction could be hard to see. They often treated church rituals with a kind of magical thinking. They might mumble a prayer like a magic formula, believing the words themselves had power. They might value a piece of a saint's bone not as a reminder of a holy life, but as a good luck charm with intrinsic power. The church was constantly fighting this tendency among its own flock, trying to teach them the correct way to believe. Magic was the ultimate expression of this incorrect, superstitious faith. Over the centuries, the church's attitude hardened. In the early Middle Ages, from roughly 500 to 1000 AD, the official view was often that magic was a foolish delusion. It wasn't that demons weren't real, but that the spells and charms of village sorcerers were mostly nonsense that didn't really work. The main problem was the belief in them, not the magic itself. A local priest might punish a charmer with penance, like fasting or extra prayers, to correct their error. But in the High and Late Middle Ages, from about 1100 onwards, the view shifted. With the rise of universities and a more systematic theology, thinkers began to create a detailed science of demons called demonology. They argued that magic was not only real, but was a vast demonic conspiracy against Christendom. In 1326, Pope John XXII issued a bull, Super Ilius Specula, that formally declared sorcery to be heresy. This was a major turning point. Magic was no longer just a sin or a superstition, it was a crime against the faith itself, an act of treason against God. This linked magic directly to heresy and gave the Inquisition, the church's body for fighting heresy, the authority to prosecute it. Now, the person accused of magic wasn't just a fool to be corrected, but an enemy to be rooted out and punished, often by death. The focus shifted from what the magician did to who the magician was. They were not just someone who used a spell, they were a heretic, a worshiper of the devil, an enemy of civilization. This shift laid all the groundwork for the explosion of witch trials in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. The medieval view of magic, refined and weaponized by the church, became one of the most destructive ideas in European history. For all the theological arguments and official decrees, magic was ultimately something people lived with every day. For the average person in a medieval village, it wasn't an abstract concept. It was a real and present part of their world, a source of both hope and immense fear. Their world was a place where a sudden illness could be a neighbor's curse, where a word spoken in anger could curdle the milk, and where the right charm could save a dying child. Life was fragile. There was no modern medicine, no scientific explanation for crop failure, no insurance against disaster. In a world full of randomness and danger, magic offered two powerful things: an explanation and a sense of control. If your child suddenly fell sick, it was terrifyingly random, but if you could believe it was the result of the evil eye from an old woman down the lane, then at least it made sense. It wasn't random anymore, it had a cause. And if it had a cause, maybe it had a cure. Maybe the local cunning man had a counter-charm. Magic provided a framework for understanding misfortune. This meant people lived in a state of constant low-level anxiety about magic. They were careful not to offend their neighbors, especially those who had a reputation for being skilled in the magical arts. A harsh word could lead to a curse. People used protective magic all the time, often without even thinking of it as magic. Nailing a horseshoe over a door wasn't a decorative choice. It was a practical way to keep evil spirits or bad luck from entering the house. It was just what you did, like closing the shutters in a storm. People existed in a kind of dual state. They were Christians. They believed in God, went to Mass, and confessed their sins to the priest. But that didn't mean they abandoned the older folk traditions. It was a practical approach. You would pray to St. Anthony to help you find a lost tool, but you might also consult a wise woman who knew a dowsing ritual. You would have the priest bless your fields to ensure a good harvest, but you might also bury a charm in the corner of the field, just in case. It wasn't about choosing the devil over God, it was about using every possible resource to survive in a difficult world. The priest took care of your soul's salvation in the next life. The cunning woman helped you get through this one. The cunning folk themselves occupied a strange and ambiguous place in society. They were both needed and feared. When your baby was sick with a fever that wouldn't break, the cunning woman was your last best hope. You would go to her, pay her with a bit of food or a few coins, and be grateful for her help. She was a healer, a finder of lost things, a counselor. But if her cure failed, or if your fortunes turned sour shortly after visiting her, that gratitude could quickly turn to suspicion. The same person who is seen as a vital community resource one day could be suspected of causing harm the next. Accusations of magic were a powerful social weapon. Grudges and village rivalries could easily escalate into charges of witchcraft. If two farmers were arguing over a piece of land and one of them suddenly had his prize ox die, it was easy to point the finger. An accusation of harmful magic, or maleficium, was a serious thing. It could ruin a person's reputation and make them an outcast. While the full-scale, organized witch hunts were more a feature of the early modern period, the seeds were sown here, in the everyday suspicions and fears of medieval village life. The world felt permeable. The boundary between the natural and the supernatural was thin. People believed that ghosts walked the earth, that fairies could steal babies from their cradles, and that demons were constantly looking for a way into their lives. Magic was the art of navigating this dangerous and mysterious world. It was a way to interact with these forces, to appease them, to ward them off, or to try and bend them to your will. So the medieval experience of magic was deeply personal and practical. It was woven into the fabric of life. It was the hope you felt when a healer gave you a poultice and a charm for your sick husband. It was the fear you felt when you heard a strange noise at night and wondered what it could be. It was the suspicion you had for the neighbor whose crops always seemed to do better than yours. It was a language for describing the unexplainable, a tool for managing the unmanageable, and a constant reminder that the world was far more mysterious and spiritually charged than it appeared on the surface. It was a world where a whispered word could be as powerful as a sword, and the line between a prayer and a spell was a line that people crossed every single day.